welcome to Haus der Kunst and to this one-day symposium that I personally have been very much looking forward to. Is the first major program accompanying our current exhibition, Frank Bowling, Mappa Mundi. An exhibition that spans 5 decades of the most intense, engaged struggle with the subject of painting on the one hand, and on the other, whether painting as such, in the context of abstraction, could be embedded with subject matter. And secondly, it also relates to the way in which post-war art admits into its history those recalcitrant forms that are neither, on the one hand, purely formal exercises, nor are they, on the other hand, matters of only personal subjectivity. But to think of painting as a world, or if painting is not a world, whether painting can be the terrain of a worldling, an idea of worldliness that extends beyond the canonical frames around which we have, over the last few centuries, understood painting. This is the fundamental subject of Frank Bowling's work in terms of his passage from British Guyana to England, with detours in Trinidad, Martinique, Spain, and finally, in the midst of coronation fever in 1953 in England, traveling from Portsmouth in the south of England by train to London and settling with his uncle just off Finchley Road. At the moment, 6 years, 6 years after the maiden voyage of Empire Windrush that brought the boat that brought tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of West Indian immigrants to post-war Britain, which for more than a decade was under reconstruction. So the citizens of empire arriving to support the motherland provided a completely new cultural context around which to think about European identity at this particular time. And how does one engage that history within the field of art? I think there's a lot to be said about that, and that's not what I'm going to do this morning, but it's just as a way of introduction, as a way of sort of thinking about the worldliness of painting as such, whether it is possible to think of that worldliness as separate or entangled with what post-war abstraction sought to do in the midst of the Cold War. How to shift or to depart from the binary between the capitalism of the West and the socialism of the communist bloc. This was not, as you will see, the particular topic that that generation of Empire Windrush were engaged with. They were artists, they were intellectual writers, many of whom today have become important touchstones in our critical thinking about the subject of history and the subject of who can be the subject of history. And that is to say that in Berlin's work, the triangulation of the New World, what between Africa, the Americas, and Europe, what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic, complicates the very question of history. And it complicates the question of who could be the subject of history, at least beginning in the mid-15th century or the late 15th century, when the first slaves arrived in the New World with the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus, and so on and so forth. So that is why the title of our symposium is called "The Sea is History," and is taken from a magnificent poem by the Nobel laureate, the St. Lucian Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, who wrote, I'll just read a short excerpt from his poem, "The Sea is History." Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea has locked them up. The sea is history. So how does history engage with the Black Atlantic? And how might we entangle the subject of culture and art within this broad terrain of both painting but also of the Black Atlantic? So the whole exploration takes us to yet another member of that generation, this time not a member of the Empire Windrush, but of another relationship to the Caribbean, or to Caribbeanness, not to the Caribbean as place, but as imagination. And that is the work of the Martinican writer, poet, and philosopher, Édouard Glissant, who himself has become, there's a bit of an infatuation in the art world with Glissant, in the art world, but an infatuation that comes with erasure. It comes with the erasure of race. In the discourse of Glissant, it comes with an erasure that proceeds from the inattentive reading of Glissant and the complexity of the ideas that Glissant tried to tease out about the new world between the Caribbean and South America, where bowling actually comes from. Bowling is not from the Caribbean, but rather from a society that's the only Anglophone country in South America, surrounded by Dutch Guyana, French Guyana, and of course up in the south, Brazil, and the Amerindian populations that are there, or that were there before. So how do we think about the subject of settling and unsettling those forms of inattentive reading? It is not necessarily to throw down a gauntlet to my dear colleagues in the art world who, in their insistence on the notion of mondialité, takes a fragment from Glissant's rather big idea and sort of condensed it to what I will call the figure of fashion. How might one rescue Glissant from that inattentiveness? So Glissant is very much part of this discussion, and I'm so glad that we have here today, speakers who will touch on some of these subject matter. So, and of course, Bowling himself is positioned between Batica, where he was born. Let's just simply say that Batica, for Bowling, is a scene of multiple triangulations. He was born in this very small town where there is a confluence of rivers, the Essequibo, flowing from all the way from Brazil, cutting the country in half, and then being joined by the Mazaruni and Cuyuni rivers before it emptied into the Atlantic Ocean. That's one triangulation. I spoke already about the other triangulation between Caribbeanness, Americanness, and Europeanness in his work. And thirdly, the triangulation between painting as a scene of history, abstraction as a way to deal with the notion of the figure with the map paintings. Can we see the first slides? So that is why we titled the exhibition, oh dear, this is going backwards. I've turned it completely off. I'm not very good at using this. Can somebody just simply process it? Okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, that's why it's really very cool design. That seems almost unreadable. Mappa Mundi, and Mappa Mundi goes to the question of that worldliness of painting, and that when Bowling sort of slightly abandoned figuration in his early work, and I think that Courtney Martin, who more than most has studied Bowling, written about him, exhibited his work, might be able to touch on this question in her presentation. But when he abandoned figuration, it wasn't so much that he abandoned the figure, depending on the way in which we identify the figure as whether it's human or landscape or a terrain. And that's Bowling at 83. And of course, these are the rooms of the exhibition. The colors are a little bit too muddy and yellow, but I think the paintings do sing when you get into the gallery. And just know that your ticket for this morning, does it admit them to the exhibition? No, oh, sorry. Okay, but you get to see it, just, But the point I was trying to sort of to make is that in that very early moment when Bowling began what became the map paintings, that it was a search, for grounding, both on a personal level in terms of the painting here Mel Edwards decides from 1968, and the painting on the right, Middle Passage, where again this question of the worldliness of painting is staged, but it's a world of carnage, which many of you might be able to read in Walcott's poem, The Schooner Flight, where a section of that poem touches again on the Middle Passage, and where names are named, the boats commandeered by the great admirals, de Grasse, Nelson, and so on, passing by. But so that scene of translation, that is the site of painting, is one that is very, very important, and the way of how landscape is treated. So you see Middle Passage, and so this is where the autobiographical and the continental, as it were, sort of combine. So below is the motif. Well, I better not touch something else here. Of the shape of Guyana, and of course the South American shape, and the stencil of Bolin's name. But he was working simultaneously with two formats, one where he began introducing the stencils into the work. The other was the use of silk screens and other images as underlays of painting itself, so you can see vestiges of the figure appearing and receding from view. And I believe that this is the very first map painting, South America Squared, to the right, and the painting here, Raining Down South. This is, of course, after Bolin had moved from London, permanently from London to New York in 1966, when these explorations began, how to sort of to deal with some of these issues and questions. So you see it in the gallery, and these are very monumental works, and we wanted to sort of by the way, let me introduce my co-curator of the exhibition, Anna Schneider, who is here. So Anna, if I get it wrong, please tell me. So, just going to move very quickly. The importance of these, scenes of encounter that Bolin was very interested in. Of course, the entanglement of the silk screen, with the stencils, with the mother's home in Guyana, in New Amsterdam, and of course South America. This was an obsession that lasted about 4 years before he finally felt that he had come to the limit of what he could do with this subject matter. So the paintings are incredibly delicate, and I will show you a very short clip by Bolin speaking about the his intentions in terms of the material of paint itself, and the way that material is the subject of the work of the artist and not the artist himself. And it's really very important to mention the incredible work of conservation and presentation of these monumental works by Hales Gallery in London that have done a magnificent work on behalf of Bolin. So the last room in the exhibition sort of engages with this notion of transparency and opacity. And of course, Glissant was very much interested in the notion of opacity. And here is Bowling trying to sort of to deal with the idea of England, the England of Turner, the England of, what are the other painters? Gainsborough and so on. It's very easy to forget some of these provincial English painters, landscape painters, and so on. So, just joking. And here, you know, Bowling is very interested in the, you know, in the Thames and the that reflection, the way the water itself, because that's been a preoccupation in his own work. These bodies of water, the rivers, and the recurrence of that, and the sea. So these paintings are really very, very daring paintings. They're sort of looking at fish scales glinting in the sun. So there is an, you know, that physicality and the opticality of the paintings going against the dark mood, as if all the debris are sort of caught in this bramble that Bowling himself had fashioned. So the thickness of these paintings of wintergreens and Batica flat that seem not to admit light, this tension, it's not a binary in the work, but it's this tension of negotiating Glissant's notion of opacity, and where Glissant speaks at a particular moment in Caribbean discourse where, you know, history becomes this inverted mirror. And Michael Dash is here, who so wonderfully rendered Glissant's very idiosyncratic genre, you know, not defining, but defeating mode of writing. The Caribbean discourse is really experimental writing. It's really, you know, top-notch level. But this weird, it is a kind of the Caribbean as a mirror, the dark mirror in which the Enlightenment can see itself, so to speak, the European Enlightenment and so on, and how the artist has engaged productively time and time again with this subject matter, and of course the incredible importance of the work of Stewart Hall, who was also Bowling's contemporary, older than Bowling by 2 years, but they both arrived in England 1 year apart. You know, Glissant to study at Merton College in Oxford, and of course, not Glissant, Hall, as many of you know, was one of the founders of British Cultural Studies and the founding editor of the New Let Review and all of that. So these, you know, generation of artists and thinkers really accompanied each other's work. And of course, Walcott was a close associate of Bowling, because Bowling will oftentimes stop off in Trinidad, and Walcott will pick him up, spend a few days boozing before he continued on his way to Guyana, because that was always the transit point. So can we see the video very quickly? And then I'll get off the stage, because there are more important things to talk about, that if I dare try to cover what I have here, we might never get off the stage. Yeah. So the video you're going to watch comes from a conversation I had with Bowling during the event of the opening of the exhibition a few months ago in June. As an acolyte, but I just want to get back to New York and color, intensity, rage, pleasure, and all of that.
I was lucky in this.
Yeah, you know, your relocation to New York really changed the language of your work.
It did, yes.
And this is really at the very center of the exhibition
that's true, yeah.
that you will see very shortly.
Yes, it was revealed to me, and I was doing the work because, that freedom, that marvelous drive that the Americans seem to adopt of newness and, being in a new world, the penny dropped for me that, here it was. You didn't have to be able to draw like or you named Dura, or you didn't have to be able to do that. You could sort of make the paint deliver the sort of feelings that you were sort of entirely sort of souped into, and that freed me because somehow when I arrived in New York, color field painting was emerging. And I accidentally found myself involved in color field painting because during my student years and the kinds of lectures and stuff we were exposed to about the color, color being, the sort of energy in Western painting and stuff, I found that letting the color flow, let it bleed, like gathering in pools and stuff like that, made me feel, I got satisfaction out of just letting the material, the subject of the artist, free. And one can never forget the kinds of rigid discipline that you have to go through, learning to walk, learning to run, it's this kind of, you don't give those up. So always the work has to jive with the discipline of organizing that rectangle that you're trying to express yourself on. So there was always geometry and color in the work, and I just ran for it.
And a very central, part of the exhibition is devoted to the map paintings.
Yes.
Can you discuss their development and how that happened?
Well, as I was leaving London, I was in a rage for one specific moment over the top, I think, now. My work, our work, the work of the young artists in London started to, even though it's fragmented, there were people from Australia and New Zealand and people from the Far East also in the mix. It seemed suddenly that the whole business of subject matter didn't seem to, it wasn't that urgent, right? You could play with it if you like. And I left London already trying to use color in a lavish way in my work. And when I got to New York, the first memorable image that I can remember, can I recall, was I pouring the paint on an area of canvas that had the one thing that I felt that I should hang on to was a bowling variety store, my mother's establishment in Amsterdam. That image, because of its sort of what it meant to me, and also the way this architecture had coalesced all over the then British Guyana with a sort of special architecture that is influenced by the subcontinent people, Indians, and you go to the countryside and you see the way the Indians have decorated their temples and Muslims, let's say, and all the flags and stuff. It had a kind of a structure that you read in terms of visual dynamics, right? So I hung on to that, but the flooding of the color, one of the things that I was still conscious about was about how the French were always at the British in the New World, and de Gaulle was beating a drum for,
He means Charles de Gaulle.
And there were caricaturists making things about de Gaulle's nose. And I found that the stains that emerged on the piece of canvas I was working on the floor, and trying to follow the light coming in the window, using the light to red through green, this kind of thing, reading it in terms of, the basic geometry of color. There's an area appeared like a caricature that I'd seen about de Gaulle's nose. And that's what turned into South America. Literally, that's how it worked. De Gaulle's nose suddenly became South American with his cap and stuff, and I went from there.
Well, I think we can really go even deeper, but I think...
you have to look at it, I really can't talk about it in the sense of any graphic sort of development, but there was this caricature of de Gaulle that everyone in the English-speaking world knew about. That he was putting his nose into the New World, claiming the New World for France as opposed to be British, and it was a joke.
So it was a very happy accident.
A happy accident.
Yeah. That then multiplied into more.
More than I realized that on the atlas, that South America and Africa looked as though it could be one whole shape at one point, but then they shared apart, and one went this way and the other one went that way. And that drift, that continental drift, if you like, galvanized my sort of intention of the material gathering in pools and shifting and spread and bleed, all these terms that people don't know about nowadays. But that color field painting had all these sort of very factual sort of terms for stuff, that paint was, stuff. It just spread and bleed and then gathering in pools and settling into shapes that sort of reminded one of, land masses and, the sea and water all around, this kind of thing. It was an adventurous time for me, and I ended up by trying to do all the map shapes across from Africa to Australia, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.